So today we'll be in this module we'll be looking at the life cycle of a servlet. Fine. So let's begin with what is a servlet actually. What is a servlet? Servlet is a server side component, fine, which handles requests from a client and gives a response. It works on protocols. It receives a request from a client, but it works on those protocols which are based on a request and a response paradigm. Okay, mainly HTTP. Fine. Let's see what we have for this. Okay, yeah, we have servlet as a server-side Java component, but this Java component, who manages this? No, the servlet is not part of the standard JDK. Remember that. One more point here is servlet is not part of the Java component standard JDK. So you have your standard JDK, that we have various versions of JDK coming, but servlet is a separate specification. It is the specification for the server side. We have various specifications of the servlet, okay, which is so this specification normally talks about a servlet container which would be available behind a web server to handle the requests coming from a client and giving back responses to the client. Okay. So we have fine. So servlets would be used inside a web container. Now the specifications for servlet, there have been various specifications. We have various versions of our specifications coming. Okay. We have specifications. The latest specification, the current specification which we are looking at here, which the latest specification available at this time is servlet specifications 3.1. The previous specifications have been there. In the specification for version specification 2.0, there was a major change which was introduced. The change was, okay, servlet not as just a component independently, but rather the concept of a web application was introduced and it was formalized. The structure of a web application was formalized, fine. And yes, we had a formal way, so formalization of the web application where the various components in a web application could be specified. So the various components of a web application would be like you have the servlet as one of the important components as part of any web application which involves Java based web application, fine. And you could have any of your other static data content, whatever, fine. So yes, now what we have here is we have a servlet container, or also commonly we might use the term as web container. They mean almost the same thing, fine, which are behind a server, fine. They would be behind a server, and normally it would be some web server which which would in turn pass on responses, pass on requests coming from a client to a container. So let's see what is, because our servlet is going to be used inside a container, inside a servlet container. The management of the objects of the servlet is not going to be done by our application directly. The creation of a servlet object, what method to be invoking a method on our servlet object, no, all that is not done by our application. All that is the responsibility of a servlet container. How it works? So for that, yes, a slight understanding related to the servlet containers. Yes, we have various servlet containers, some examples of servlet containers which are commonly available in the market. The most commonly known to everyone is the Tomcat server, fine, that is a servlet container. We do have something like JBoss, JRun, we do have that Glassfish, fine. Now yes, earlier we talked about versions of our servlet, fine. Servlet specification has various versions. These containers are developed, they are nothing but implementations of these specifications. So, earlier the Tomcat server used to be a reference implementation. So, like whenever we had a new specification for the servlet, we would have a new version of Tomcat which would be used as a reference implementation by others. But since our last specification, that is specifications 3.0, it is the Glassfish which is being used as a reference implementation for the servlet specifications. Fine, but anyway, most commonly still it is the Tomcat server which is most commonly being used. So, most references whenever we talk about anything to do with the servlet container or in our examples will be referring to Tomcat. Okay, but anyway, for our current module we are just going to talk about the life cycle of a servlet. Fine, okay, life cycle. Where is the servlet going to be managed? Who is managing it? It is the container who is managing it. We have concept of a web application. So, what do we have? Oh, a web application has several URLs. Fine. So, a web application is nothing but an application where within a particular server. Yes, how do we identify within a particular server? Most of the time, how do we identify a server? We identify using a URL. In a URL, yes, a URL identifies a server. How? Oh, simple example. You have http:// What is the next thing? Next part is nothing but your domain, or that is your server. Slash. Oh, the first slash. What do we have there? There we say, oh, we have a path there. Now here, after the first slash, whatever is there, fine, it's nothing but a group of URLs. So slash and then that URL, whatever it indicates, is indicative of a web application. So all those URLs which have this common thing name after a slash. For example, you may say, oh, I have a web application for an inventory, then I would have my server find your http:// my server / I would have my inventory as my application, and then slash I have so many resources within my inventory web application. So, we have the concept of a web application being a group of URLs or a group of resources rather. Okay, and one such resource is a servlet. Okay. Oh, how does it become a resource? Oh, for that, yes, we have a configuration corresponding to our web application. So, we have a server, or we say a web container, servlet container, in which we have the option of deploying multiple web applications, and each web application in turn has its own set of resources, and many of those resources are Java based resources which are in form of a servlet. Okay. So, within the configuration for a particular web application, we may configure several servlets to be part of the application. And then, we also have within this configuration, we also map a URL pattern, some resource. URL identifies a resource. So, we map a URL pattern with our servlet, which is simple Java component. Okay. Fine, we will see what kind of Java component it is very soon. Fine. So, yes, this is what comes as part of configuration of a web application. So, let us see what exactly happens when we start a web container. Yes, let us see. So, when a web container starts up, the first thing it would do is look at all the deployed web applications. Yes, we have different kind of web applications, and each web application, how to deploy a web application can be specific to that web application, but the structure of the application is a standard thing. We will not talk about the structure here. Fine, we will concentrate more on looking at the servlet's life cycle, but okay, fine. So, we have our container coming up, looking for deployed applications. Fine, whatever it identifies as the deployed web applications, corresponding to each deployed web application, it would create an object of a servlet context. Okay. So, we have a servlet context object corresponding to each web application. So, if we have 5 web applications deployed, we will have 5 different instances of our servlet context object. So, that is fine, that is one part of it. Oh, no servlet yet, fine. But when it creates this object of servlet context, it will read the configuration corresponding to this web application. Okay. Oh, so, for each web application, whenever it is deployed, you would have also specified a configuration, fine, which talks about the servlets in that particular application. So, the next step it would have to do is as part of this startup. So, this is the startup part of my web application. The servlet container is doing a startup on the application. So, as part of it, yes, when it starts up, it has created servlet context. Next, as part of this creation, it is also looking at the configuration. From the configuration, it will be able to pick up what are the various servlet objects which need to be created. What we have only specified there in the configuration, or I have developed so and so classes, which is a servlet class. So, you given your list of servlet classes in the configuration, the role of container here is to create those objects, fine. So, you identify the class, you only mention the class names, you mapped your class names to some name of a, you given a name to each of those objects which would be of a particular class. So, that comes from the configuration. So, role of container is to create an object of the servlet class which is mentioned in configuration. Next step, oh, now creation of the servlet is fine. Okay. So, one requirement here would be whatever servlet class you have created, see to it that you have the public default constructor available. We normally would not put any constructor, leaving it. So, when we develop any servlet class, we leave it as it is. Okay, fine. Okay, or developing a servlet, how do you do it? Okay, so yes, for servlet, as I mentioned, we have a separate specification, and this specification talks about 2 things. We have 2 packages here. We have the javax.servlet package, okay, which is talking about the general specification related to a servlet. Okay. In general, how a servlet should be. It is for giving response to requests, how to handle request and give a response back to clients, but it is not talking about any specific protocol. But one thing, we have what all servlet specification, what the servlet specification also mandates is, yes, we have this generic portion, but every implementation of a servlet container must always be supporting the HTTP protocol. You may support other protocols, fine, a servlet container may support other protocols. Fine, for example, we do have certain servlet containers which do support protocol like SIP, fine, which is used for voice over IP, fine. But here, okay, so you may have some such containers. We have these containers, we can have containers which can support other protocols. HTTP is compulsory, and because HTTP is compulsory, as part of the servlet specification, we also have another package which is javax.servlet.http that talks specific of HTTP protocol. Fine. Here in this module, we are going to be talking about the generic part and the life cycle only. Fine. We are only going to talk about the life cycle of the servlet, and fine, not going into the HTTP part here. Later we will be introducing, we will have several other modules which will be talking and going from general part to the specific part related to HTTP protocol. Fine. So, at this moment, let us proceed further and look at the other parts of the servlet specification. So, fine. So, proceeding further, yes, what do we have? We have our container having created the object of servlet, fine, which was coming from the knowing from the configuration. So, during its startup, it does all this, and then what is the next step? After creating object, what is it supposed to do? Oh, in our configuration, we might have some initialization parameters. We want to give some information related to what are the databases this servlet may be trying to access. So, we may have to use some configuration information to be made available to our servlet object. So, all such information is going to be encapsulated inside an object of servlet config. So, we have an object of servlet config being created by the container after it has read from the configuration. Based on the configuration, it creates a servlet config object, and then the next step it does. Yes, it has already created the object of servlet. Now, the next step, which is here, the first method invocation taking place on our servlet object. So, we say this is our first lifecycle method on the servlet, and the first lifecycle method here is the method called init, where it is passing as parameter a servlet config object, making available the configuration corresponding to the servlet object which has been created. Fine. So, with this, the initialization of the servlet can take place. Now, one more point here is, it is not necessary that the container would do this init method for all the servlets, but yes, of course, as part of configuration, it could have been mentioned that, oh, in this servlet, I want it to be loaded right at the startup. See, we are looking at the startup phase of our servlet container, fine, during which creation of servlet context had taken place. For this servlet context, whatever are the configured servlet, those are being created and those are being initialized. So, this creation and initialization using the init method would only happen, would necessarily or is compulsorily going to happen for all those servlets which have been configured to be to have to be loaded on startup. So, we have this setting where in our configuration file we can specify that, oh, this servlet needs to be loaded on startup. So, it is only for those that this that it is compulsory for a container to do a init method right at the beginning itself. So, okay, so in the startup phase of our container, it is most likely that the init method of the servlet would be getting invoked and our servlet instances are created and ready to give service. So, first phase, first part or the first lifecycle method here is the init method, which may take place normally in the startup phase of our container. Next, what the container does once it has finished with the startup phase, once it has created all the resources, it is now becoming ready to service requests coming from a client. So, yes, what does it do for it? So, in this second phase, once it is ready, it is now waiting for clients to make a request. So, yes, we make requests from various browsers, most of the time the client is a browser, or it could be any other web client. So, or whatever the protocol here, yes, most commonly it is going to be the web client. So, a web protocol, HTTP protocol, which will be using here, for which the servlets are written. Fine. So, in this case, now after the startup is over, whenever a client makes sends a request using a URL to the server, okay, the server would in turn proceed those requests to the container, and within the container, what will the container do? Okay, container knows the HTTP protocol or whatever the protocol, fine. From the protocol, fine, it will extract the request, fine. It will extract the information which is part of the request coming from a client, information about the client connection, information related to the various information which the client is interested in sending to the servlet. All that information is going to be encapsulated in an object of servlet request. So, it creates an object of servlet request. Not only it is creating object of a servlet request, it is also allocating a buffer. It is preparing a buffer where the response can be prepared by a servlet. So, it creates two objects initially. When a request comes from a client, it is going to create two objects, one for a servlet request object, which is going to have information related to the client, related to any information coming from the parameters, various parameters which a client might have sent, and another one is an empty buffer encapsulated in an object of servlet response. These two objects would then be made available. Oh, first thing, before it has to made available, it has to also identify which in this request it is meant for which servlet. It identifies the servlet because of the mapping of a URL. fine. It identifies the servlet and then invokes the method which is meant for servicing, and that method name is service. So, we have a regular invocation of service method. Okay. Now, at this point, another thing, it is also possible if you have not mentioned load on startup for a particular servlet, not configured to be load on startup, it is also likely that for this servlet, for the servlet which is meant for this request, the object may not have been created, the initialization may not have taken place. In such a case, for the first time arrival of such a request, the container, it is a container's job to create an object and then create an object and initialize using passing it the servlet config, the one what happens for most of the servlets in the startup phase of the container. So, yes, in case the object is not there, it can still be getting created, and so yes, it would take a little longer for the first time arrival of such a request. And once this is, so yes, it is a service method which is invoked, and in the service method the two objects, one is the servlet request object and the servlet response object which has our blank buffer. Both of these objects are given to the servlet with the help of service method. Now, within the service method, what would you do? Okay. You are free to look at the information which has arrived as part of the servlet request, use it, do your own processing on the server side, maybe you access some database, fine, and oh, now it is this servlet which is now responsible for deciding what is the content that I would like to send to the client. The whole content which the servlet wants to be sent to the client is then put into the buffer available from the servlet response. Oh, how to access the buffer of the servlet response? Oh, we are not looking at it currently. We will have a later module on discussing the servlet related APIs. So, yes, we will discuss most of the methods at that moment, but yes, the process is going to be like this. We will have invocation of service method. As part of invocation, the servlet request object and servlet response object handed over to the through service method to the servlet object. Within the service method, we have to use methods on our servlet request to extract the information, maybe if you are interested in extracting information coming from the client side, do your own processing of the request. Once you have done the processing, you may decide what is the output I would like to send. So, once you have decided what kind of output you would like to send, put all that output into that buffer which is part of the servlet response. Once that has been done, that is it, the service method's role is over. Once you have put the things into the buffer, your service method is done with. And once the service method, as soon as the service method is over, okay, the container takes charge again. Container had invoked the service method, because it knows the service method is over, it takes charge again. It is now the role of the container to look into what the servlet had done, in what it has put into the buffer, use the protocol to send this content which was part of the buffer back to the client. So, the response is created by the servlet, but it is sent by the container. So, we have responsibilities here, separate responsibilities. So, first life cycle method, initialization, init method may be invoked in startup or in the first time invocation for a particular servlet, fine, first time request coming for a particular servlet. Okay. Fine. Once the object of servlet has been created, and fine, it would not normally go down, fine. So, this service method is something which is regularly getting invoked as and when the client sends a request to the container, fine. So, yes, we have only one time invocation of init, multiple invocations for service method, and that is a regular job. But yes, what do we have? We have our web container. Now, this web container would have administrative tools also. For administrative reasons, we may have to bring down our container, fine. We want to bring down our particular web application. So, whenever we bring down that particular web application here, okay, what would be done? We have our component, fine, they were working. Okay. So, these components will have to be Fine. There has to be a proper shutdown to be done for our application. So, when we talk of a proper shutdown, it is not just abruptly everything has to stop. Okay, you have some database connections, you have taken some resources, you may like to release them properly, fine, do a proper shutdown. So, in order to achieve this, what has been done is, we have our final lifecycle method of our servlet called the destroy method. In this destroy method, yes, we have what we normally do is do the finalization. This destroy method is going to be again called by the container whenever it decides that this servlet is to be unloaded. The reason for deciding to unload it, administrator deciding to shut down bring down the application. Other reasons could be, oh, it is running out of memory and it feels that, oh, this particular servlet not being used, maybe I will bring it up again, initialize it later on. Let me bring it down so that I can have more memory. So, for different reasons it may have to destroy. So, yes, we have our destroy method where we do our finalization related to whatever this servlet object was doing. Okay. Another thing, a few other finer points here related to the init method again. We have in the init method, if the init, what happens if the init method fails and what are the failures? Init method failing means, oh, this particular URL, because remember a servlet corresponds to a URL. Oh, that means this particular URL should not be working, fine. So, whenever our init method fails, the init method would throw unavailable exception. We have an exception called unavailable exception, which may be thrown by the init method to indicate, oh, I can't start at this moment. I don't have the proper things, resources what I need available, and therefore I cannot start. So, when such a thing happens, it is this, or even from within the service method also, at any moment there can be kind of a failure where the servlet feels that, oh no, I can no longer give any service. So, whenever the servlet feels that, okay, I can no longer give this service, this URL cannot be serviced further, it would throw unavailable exception. So, whenever unavailable exception is thrown, the container is going to remember this, and from that point onwards, if any request comes for this particular URL, it is handled at the container level itself. The container has to give the appropriate negative response to it, saying, oh, this particular service is no longer available. Fine. Another point related to this unavailable exception. While throwing unavailable exception, it is, you have an option here, if you are throwing an unavailable exception, to specify a timeout. If you have mentioned a timeout, it is also possible for a container to again try after that time to bring the servlet back into service. It would try to create the object and then go through the initialization again. So, that is one thing which is related to the service being unavailable. So, we have that unavailable exception for this purpose, which you may throw from init method right at the beginning itself, or it could have been done in the middle of some service method. Okay. Another point which is related to the destroy method, an important point here. Yes, we have multiple clients accessing our servlet simultaneously. That means, we have simultaneous invocations of service methods taking place on our single instance of servlet. Okay. So, we have service method coming regularly. Now, when there is a shutdown kind of a thing, or when the container says, oh, I need to destroy this, fine. So, if it wants to destroy the application, the container normally has to try to ensure that there is no service which is currently active on this servlet before I start using the destroy method, fine. Because in destroy method, we will be just trying to do the release of all the resources which are required during the service method. Okay. So, for this reason, yes, the container would stop any further invocations of service on this particular servlet, have some kind of a time duration, give some time for the currently ongoing service methods to finish, and if some of them do take much longer, then only it is likely that yes, there is some service which is active while the destroy is taking place. So that's what we have here. So we have, so yes, that's a thing which is under consideration, that is destroy method normally should be called while no service method is in progress. So it tries to ensure like this. So yes, here finally what we have three important lifecycle methods in a servlet. First, used for doing the initialization, that's done with creation and init method invocation. We have regular invocations of the service method in order to service request coming for this particular URL corresponding to the servlet, and then we have the destroy method whenever the servlet is going to be removed from service. That's fine. So this is what we have for the lifecycle method. Rest we'll cover in our next modules. Fine. That's it.